Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be the first video in the read-along series that I and a group of other booktubers are doing of Stephen R. Donaldson's The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever, which I think we failed to give a catchy name, but I'm gonna call it the Unbeliever-along or something like that because why not? Good enough, right? So book one in this series is Lord Foul's Bane. This first came out in 1977, and it is the first of the first trilogy in this series. There is a second trilogy and then a set of 4. For the purposes of this read-along, we're only talking about the first 2 trilogies, and this is a hybrid epic fantasy, portal fantasy, in which the main character is an American guy living his somewhat unfortunate life because he's been diagnosed with leprosy. And despite the fact that this is set in the years that are really on the precipice of leprosy being classified as a curable disease, his neighbors are still treating him like an outcast, and he's about to get hit by a car, and boom, he goes to a very Tolkien-esque fantasy world where he goes on adventure but believes he's probably hallucinating or dreaming, and thus names himself the Unbeliever, and off we go. This was a reread for me, and I originally hadn't realized that it was a reread for me. When Brian from Bookish proposed that we do a read-along of this, he had asked me if I'd read this before, and I told him that no, I had only read part of the final series in this series of series. But then later I realized that no, that at least the first 2, if not the first full trilogy, I have read. But as with a lot of fantasy series that I read between the ages of about 11 and 15, I remembered virtually nothing about this. As it's gone on, I realized that I do remember quite a bit from the second volume of this series, which is interesting because I think that plays into what my expectations of this are, both because it wasn't memorable, so I think that means something on its own, but also because as I'm going along I was remembering more bits and pieces of things that happened later, so I wasn't having the full new reaction or the full reread reaction, I think. And I'm talking about reactions to this just because a lot of people do have very strong reactions to this, both in the way that a lot of fantasy series do, in that depending on the point in your life at which you have read this, and also the point in your general fantasy reading in which you have read this, because I think a lot of fantasy epics in particular are difficult to read out of the context of the other fantasy series that you've interacted with, just because they are all so interrelated. I mean, can you talk about portal fantasy without talking about the influence of, say, an Alice in Wonderland or a Chronicles of Narnia situation? Can you talk about epic fantasy without talking about Lord of the Rings, right? You probably can't. And while I wouldn't say that this is a ripoff in the same way that the first Shannara book is a clear remapping of the Lord of the Rings, although this series does become quite different later, I see people talking about this as though it were revolutionary, and I both don't buy that it actually is revolutionary, but I completely believe that it could be revolutionary depending on what you have read before. Because the main character in this is very unlikable. He is different in that if you have primarily read a lot of high fantasy in which there is a noble character questing forth who is, you know, beautiful and the pinnacle of manhood, this is a character who is, one, a rapist, which the scene where he rapes a teenager fairly early on is what turns off a lot of people from this series, because this is not the character that they want to join on this journey, which I think is fair enough. I think a lot of people who love this series are dismissive of the people who are turned off by that, but I think that's completely fair, especially because I don't think this is dealt with well, although some people make the argument that it is, which I tend to think is fanishness talking, and because the character has leprosy, people who are used to seeing the beautiful hero feel like that's very revolutionary. Personally, I think those two things together are one of the biggest cliches in here, and I think, for me, one of the reasons that I think this is good enough, but isn't going to be above that, is because it plays so much into that particular cliche. In not just fantasy, but in storytelling in general, there are so many cases in which the character who is diseased, disfigured, or disabled is also the villain, because the stereotype being they're a monster on the outside and the inside. If you think about all the James Bond villains with facial scars, if you think about Captain Hook and all the horror movies where characters with hooks for hands who go around murdering people, it's a very common cliche in addition to being a general stereotype. And so when we walk into that scene in this series, I find it disappointing, not because we're watching a rape scene, but because we're falling into this cliche of, oh, he's ugly on the outside and the inside, and I think that's weak. As far as I'm concerned, that makes the character much less interesting, because it is such a commonly used I keep wanting to say trope because that's what everybody says on BookTube, but that's not really the right word. It's such a commonly used piece in literature that when I first read Tad Williams' series, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, I kept waiting for one of the princes in this book to become evil, because this character only has one hand, and in not only fantasy, but in a lot of fiction that plays on very particular ideas, that's what they use. So I was shocked when, I mean, spoiler, he's a good guy. He's not morally conflicted. And it was shocking to read this and be like, wow, the amputee is not evil. Who even knew that fantasy authors knew that they could do that? Whereas if we had had the same kind of bitter, angry character, still a guy with leprosy, still going on this adventure and whining and disbelieving it, it at least wouldn't be quite such a cliche. And on the flip side, if he were evil and relishing it in the way that a lot of the main characters in grimdark fantasy do, I think that would be more inspiring. And I've seen people who name this as being kind of a proto grimdark hero, and I disagree with that entirely, because I don't think the character ever really accepts himself as someone who does something monstrous. And one of the whole points of grimdark is that it's almost exploitatively focused on people doing horrific things, and doing horrific things maybe because they're the kind of evil that just embraces that, or maybe because of necessity and blah blah blah. But the character in this doesn't do either of those things, so I don't buy him as a proto-grimdark hero. He's just an unpleasant guy. I mean, I think if you were going to make that argument, you could just as easily make the argument that as a whiner, he's a proto-YA hero, because those involve a lot of whining. Anyway, I'm sounding awfully negative about this, because I actually did enjoy reading this for a lot of the external bits and pieces of it. I think this borrows from a lot of traditional fantasy stories, as I said, in a less obvious way than some of the other derivative works that came out around the same time. And I think it's more fun to point out where those connections, parallels, rip-offs, whatever you want to call them, homages if you prefer. In any case, I think that's a lot more fun than the ones where it's such a one-to-one relationship. And I will link to you to one of the videos that Steve Donahue did, because he's been doing weekly midpoint videos, and in the third of his videos, he does kind of an overview where he talks about the Tolkien-esque things that are clearly one-to-one relationships, but with slight shifts, and where he points out where the shifts are plot-wise, because I thought that was quite entertaining to watch. I'm also going to link to a really hilarious review on Amazon that was called "Lord, What a Foul Bane." This is from a reviewer who hated it, and it is a 1-star review, but I think even if you enjoy this, the review is hilarious, because it talks about the naming and the word choices in here, because this does do the random compound words for surname type thing that is common in a lot of kinds of fantasy, and it pokes fun at it in a way that I was entertained by. But I don't think you need to poke fun at that kind of thing. I think there is a certain amount of that you accept in certain types of fantasy. So if you are a fan of this, of course you accept it. And if you're not, it just irritates you, and I kind of enjoy that element. The most fun part about this for me was actually external to the book itself, and it was that, because reading this now, when leprosy is a curable disease, I had been under the impression that it had been curable since the 60s, so I was surprised by the opening chapters in the real world that are set in the 70s. And it led me down the rabbit hole of reading a bunch of things about the evolution of modern treatments for leprosy, which was fascinating. So I will link to you below, first of all, to a museum in the US that's a former leprosarium in Louisiana, which is now called the National Leprosy Museum. And there's some really fascinating stuff as they moved through a quarantine model, through a treatment model, through an outpatient model, but where people weren't leaving because they'd just been used to living there. And I'll also link to you to the National Institute of Health, which is an organization in the US as well. And they have a database of articles and references, some of which are for a general audience and some of which are abstracts from actual studies. And if you scroll through them, you can look at studies that are from between, say, 1971 and 1987. And it's just really fascinating stuff to look at how that shift happened. Now, I still think that this is maybe a little too retro. I don't know what the timeline was for when Donaldson wrote this to the point where it was published, but I do know that his choice of leprosy is because his father was a physician who who worked in, I believe, leper colonies in India, which would have been 20 years previous to this. And since the changing drug protocols started in the 60s, that would have been before the changes were made. So I found that interesting because I think some of what he's portraying was inspired by something older, or at least that's the impression that I got. But technically we are still, at this point, 4 or 5 years away from the current protocol and the understanding of leprosy as a curable disease. So I did find that to be the most entertaining part of this. So yeah, so I was very happy with having joined in on this, just because it led me down that fun bit of research. Fun is probably the wrong word for that, but I had an interesting time reading about that. It's funny, because a lot of people talk about disturbing things in this, I actually think the second one is worse, which I think is not what most people believe, primarily because of the rape scene. And which I always think is weird that people are shocked by that, because I mean, like, Dragonflight came out 10 years earlier. This is from the late 60s, and this has a whole society where people rape each other every time their dragons mate. And I think by the 80s, Anne McCaffrey had retconned a lot of what happens in this book. But still, you know, it's not as though fluffy fantasy doesn't have elements like that. But again, I think a lot of that depends on what you were reading and what framework you were reading it through, especially when these are things that a lot of people read as teenagers. I wish I had really hated it or really loved it, because I think I would have more interesting things to say other than here are some links about the history of leprosy, because that was really the main thing that I got out of this. In any case, if you were playing along with this read-along, I would love to hear what you thought of the book. Did you love it? Did you hate it? And if you read this before, especially if you read this when you were young and are returning to it now, I would love to hear where it falls within your sense of your fantasy series. Was this your fantasy series, or was it something else? I think my fantasy series that I read, or that I started reading when I was 11, and I think I finished it a few years later, was Nancy Springer's The Book of the Isle series. The second book of which I think came out in 77 as well, at least in its first form, and then she rewrote it a couple of years later. And it was, probably in some ways a bit of a Tolkien ripoff too. I would say less obviously than The Sword of Shannara, but maybe slightly more obviously, at least in terms of an elf relationship, than this one. And I don't have those books to hold up because those are ones that I took with me when I moved, so they're not in a box in this house. Anyway, if you loved or hated this, I would love to hear what you think. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.